Hello,
Hi, Jay.
how
Glad
are
to
you?
see
Nice to
you. I said, I'm glad to meet you.
glad to meet you. See, you have a couple records behind you, or CDs perhaps.
I'm about 1,000 or so.
Just about. Great. Well, thanks for joining me. The purpose of this program is basically I talk about albums that I find to be the most impactful per year. And we're now in 1965, and I'm talking about the album I Ain't Marching Anymore, of course. And then usually I bring on a guest to sort of talk about the artist. There you go, the original.
Yep.
And then we just kind of get into it. And I'd love to talk about Phil and kind of just learn a little bit more about him and let the listeners know about this amazing guy.
Well, here's something very interesting and amazing. Fast forward to 2023, 2022. There is a young woman named Tori Nelson who lives in Iowa, who is a Phil fanatic.
Okay.
And she started a podcast. And her podcast is called God Help the Troubadour, which is a line from one of Phil's songs. And if you go on there, you or your listeners or your watchers, if you go online, just type in God Help the Troubadour podcast, and it will come up. And she has a podcast just about this particular album that you want to talk about today. And it's an hour and 43 minutes. She talks about the individual songs, and then she has a group of people who discuss it, and it's fascinating. So it'll be a great follow-up for this show.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll definitely share that with the listener. It's very similar to what I do as well. So before we get into the album, I was wondering if you could just kind of talk about your upbringing and what Phil was like as a child.
Okay, upbringing. We were very dysfunctional family. It was my parents, my mother, who was a very critical person, was never happy and was always criticizing. My father, who was a doctor, but not successful because he was manic depressive. And he had episodes that really, messed up his career. So we moved around a lot. And we grew up in a time when things were on radio, like Father Knows Best or Leave It to Beaver and the Donna Reed Show. And in all of these shows, they had the perfect family. The wonderful father who's the bread provider, goes out, feeds his family nicely. The wonderful wife, lovely, stay at home, takes care of the children and raises them perfectly. And the kids who get into minor difficulties, but are always, good kids in the end. And growing up, I'm mentioning this because growing up watching that kind of thing on television, and we thought that was the normal family.
Right.
Very difficult for us. We must be weird because we're not like that. So, growing up in what turns out to be the normal family, the dysfunctional family, it was rather difficult in those days. And Phil was an introvert. Because we moved around so much, that made it really tough for him because it would take him forever to make a friend. And then he'd make a friend and then we'd move again. So he was back to square one. So this made him very introverted. And basically he lived in his own head. He loved movies and he loved to go to the movies. He watched a load of movies, much more than a normal person. But this was his escape.
Sure.
He also had a talent. He was very, very good at the clarinet.
Right.
Which he took up in junior high school and was so good they made him first clarinetist in the high school band. I mean, he was excellent, and that was his first musical experience.
Right.
And we had one other brother. I'm the oldest. Phil was the middle child, and then we had the younger brother, Michael. And so when Phil went away to college, well, high school was interesting too because we lived on the grounds of a hospital in Columbus, Ohio, an area called Bexley, which was in the outskirts. And the school system there was not so great because it was a rural community, so that a lot of the students who lived on farms, so they wouldn't show up for school until October, until after the harvest was over. And then they would cut out in May because they had to help plant, the new season. They had to help on the farm. So therefore, the level of education wasn't exactly great, to put it mildly. And I guess Phil was looking at the New York Times Magazine section, and he saw an ad for Staunton Military Academy in Virginia. And he thought, oh, that might be fun, because he loved the clarinet. If I went down to Staunton Military Academy, I could play in the marching band. That would be a very good experience. So and my mother was looking for a school for him, so she agreed to send him there. And as it turns out, he had two other guys who were in school at the same time as him were John Dean, who ended up being Nixon's whatever there,
Yeah.
and Michael Goldwater, who was Barry's son. So rather interesting time. And at that stage of his life, the writing, he loved to write, but he wrote short stories, and they got published very often in the school publications. And so that was the extent of his writing.
Okay.
And then when he went to college, it was just karma that he ended up having a roommate named Jim Glover. And Jim, by the way, our family was totally apolitical. I know they were registered Democrats, but they never talked about politics. All right, so there was a blank slate there. So
Right.
when Phil got to college, and he had Jim as a roommate, Jim's father was a socialist. He was a union activist. I mean, really, really vocal.
Mhm.
They would go to Jim's home for dinner, and Mr. Glover would basically indoctrinate Phil. And so this is where Phil got his politics, was in Jim's father's house.
Very interesting. Wow. So it was like at Ohio State when this all.
Yes, they were at Ohio State. Jim also happened to be, besides having a political father, Jim Glover happened to be a very good musician. He had a great voice, played guitar, played banjo.
Mhm.
And he taught Phil how to play the guitar, basically. And Phil got his first guitar from Jim, and he won it on a bet on the Nixon-Kennedy election.
Wow.
He won the bet, and so he won this, I think it was like a $35 K guitar, some piece of junk. But this is what he started out with. And they decided to become a duo. At first, they were going to call themselves the Singing Socialists, and of course, that doesn't really sell well. So they became the Sundowners. And I think they had one gig. The problem was Jim, with all of his talent and all of his whatever ability, was one of the, I hate to use the word lazy, but he just was very just zero energy person.
Right.
Phil would write songs, and he said, okay, Jim, we're going to sing this song on our gig Saturday night. And of course, Saturday night, Jim hadn't even learned it, so that was out of the question. And I think one of the first gigs, that maybe in their last gig, they got fired because they didn't. One of them didn't show up. I forget which one, but anyhow,
Right.
that didn't work out. So Phil became a solo artist, and then Jim went to New York, discovered the Greenwich Village scene, and kept saying to Phil, "Come on, you got to come down here." Phil was majoring in journalism at Ohio State.
Yeah.
And what happened was he was writing for the Lantern, which was the school paper, and I guess he wanted to write an article that was basically pro-Castro, and they wouldn't print it. They wouldn't let him put it in the paper. So and in his senior year, he quit college. And his attitude was, if I can't write, what's the point of being a journalism major, And besides, Greenwich Village was calling rather loudly, and so that was how he got into the Village and into all of that.
Right. And when he got there, it seems like he was motivated. He was just like, once he was in that scene, he was just in it.
He was so able to write. I mean, he read the New York Times every day, and I guess he read Newsweek, and he got all of his song ideas from the headlines in the paper every day. And he was writing nonstop. And then he got connected with who took him up to Broadside Magazine.
Mhm.
Broadside Magazine to me was one of the most important things in Phil's life. And nobody else will say this, but I'll say this because I described the family we came from, right?
Mhm.
Okay, he got to Broadside Magazine, which was run by a couple, Sis Cunningham and Gordon Freeson. And they were motivated. Pete Seeger asked him to start the magazine. First issue came out in February of 1963, and it ran through 1982, I believe. It finally stopped. You can find it in the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian has all of the issues. So do I. And anyhow, what Broadside was, it was a magazine. It was basically a bunch of papers mimeographed together. That's how it started out, and it was so amateurish looking. But every one of the guys who were writing back in that day, I'm talking about Dylan, I'm talking about Phil, I'm talking about Eric Anderson, Tom Paxton, Buffy, all of the writers of that day in the Village, what they would do is they would go up to the apartment of Sis and Gordon. Sis and Gordon had a reel-to-reel recording machine, and they would record, these guys and women would sing their songs into the recorder.
Mhm.
And then Sis would transcribe them and they'd put the magazine together. So all of every one of them, every first song of all of these people, you'll find in Broadside Magazine. It's a treasure trove if you're looking for, information about the 60s. And the reason I say that they were so important, they loved Phil. Yeah, I think overall they published about 69 of his songs. And the first time they ever put a picture on the cover, it started to evolve and get a little better. When they put a picture on the cover, issue number 36, there's a picture of Phil.
Oh, wow.
I mean,
Yeah, I was aware.
they were, to me, they were his surrogate parents. Where at home he got criticism, here he got love, appreciation, recognition.
Yeah, sense of
But to
community,
me, they were the most important people.
right? Very interesting. So did you ever visit him there? Were you around that scene in Greenwich Village yourself?
I stayed home. I didn't go into the Village. I lived out in Rockaway. I went to the beach instead.
Yeah. I get you. Interesting.
I wasn't into being in this. I'm not a city person. I
Right.
live in the woods even to this day. I'm a rural person. But so that's why I think Broadside was so special for Phil.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it was a pretty remarkable time period for sure, but somewhat short-lived, I think, right? The Greenwich Village folk scene.
Yeah, but it sure did. Well, it was the right place to be in those days because in those days, because of the Vietnam War, protest music was very important and folk music became very important. It started out, I'd say, well, I got into folk music because of a group called the Kingston Trio.
Sure. Hmm.
That was the first folk music I ever heard.
Right.
But, the purists will argue and say that's not folk music. But to me, they were terrific. Their harmonies were amazing. And they took folk songs and basically modernized them. They did a lot of old songs. Another group was the Limelighters.
Sure.
Those were the ones that got me going. And the ones that kept me going were Peter, Paul, and Mary.
Mhm.
People put them down. They're too polished, blah, blah, blah. I have news for you. They were wonderful.
I agree with you.
And they were the reason why a lot of people turned to folk music because
Yeah.
they were so good. So
Yeah. Maybe it was their popularity that might have turned people off, but yeah, when you really break down their ability in their songs.
they were so important.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I went on the March on Washington in 1963, down in Washington, and you think about who was at that event. I mean, the musicians that were there were amazing.
Unbelievable. Mhm.
And so what happened was it sort of became, it was like the mainstream music. I mean, things are so splintered today. It's horrible, absolutely horrible. But back in the day, it was basically they had like the top 40, a lot of stations played what they call the top 40, and a lot of this music was in the top 40, and it was being heard all over the country. I mean, nowadays it's so splintered. People listen to a country station, or listen to a rap station. It's so split. But back in those days, it was more, continuity, and there was more listening to different kinds of stuff.
Mhm.
So we've lost that now, unfortunately, because I think it's important.
I agree with you. And wow, you answered like 10 of my questions in a row, which is great. So his first album, All the News That Fit to Sing, 1964, and then I Ain't Marching Anymore.
Right.
Could you talk about the impact of that particular album?
I Ain't Marching.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it's funny. I haven't looked at his stuff in a while. I do a radio show myself, but I'm trying to stay with the old people. But I don't like to play too much of Phil because that'd be nepotism. So I cheat. I play his songs sung by other people.
Right.
But because you asked me to do this, I glanced at the album,
Sure.
and it was wow. I have the original the LP here, and I this was so sad today that with the CDs we've lost so much. You
Yes, I
look at
agree.
the album, and on the back of the album is a very interesting piece written by Phil himself, really lovely piece. And then there's an article written by somebody named Bruce Jackson talking about Phil and his music. And then on the side, they list the songs that are on the album, and there's a little comment about each song. And I find these fascinating. And then I looked at the choice of songs. It was such an eclectic mix on this particular album. I think is fabulous because it kind of shows every side of him. There's anti-war stuff, there's humor, there's seriousness, there's a lot of stuff civil rights.
Mhm.
Two powerful songs, In the Heat of the Summer and Here's to the State of Mississippi.
Yep.
I mean, and I Ain't Marching Anymore, of course, which became sort of his anthem. And then Draft Dodger Rag, which is a really funny takeoff about people who dodge the draft. And then this labor stuff, that's what I want to hear. I think it's one of the best labor songs that he wrote. And
Right.
it's like saying that, you're not alone, look around you. You're not the only one who's having problems. If you join together,
Yeah.
it's a call for action. I said that should have been when they had that movement, the Occupy movement, that should have been the theme song.
Yeah, it would have been fitting for sure.
Perfect. And then he also talks about the downside of labor unions, links on the chain. So
Mhm.
that's also on here. The
Right.
fact, if you think about labor unions are great, but my God, if your uncle or your father wasn't in, you're not in either. And it really discriminates
Right.
against the people. So there's that. And then that was the president. He really loved John Kennedy. And he wrote a very moving song about him after he died. And then even talks about the electric chair. Iron Lady is about the electric chair. And then he took a very old poem. I mean, it is so eclectic. The Highwayman
Yeah.
by Alfred Noyes, and I think he wrote the perfect melody for that song. It is so stunning. And when I was teaching, I used to use that in my classroom, and the kids, no matter what background, absolutely loved it. They got it because it was such a beautifully told story. And then he did record one song by somebody else, which is Ballad of the Carpenter by Ewan McCall, which is
Right.
about Jesus, which is a really, really beautiful song. And so he included that. And then another song that the words were somebody else, but he wrote the melody, and that was The Men Behind the Guns.
Mhm. Yep.
And then Days of Decision, there's a guy in Wales who contacted me recently, and he wanted to do an album of Phil's songs. His name is Martin Joseph. He's been around for 20 years doing music in Wales, and he's been over to the States. He's performed here, and he decided he wanted to do an album, and that's what he called his album, Days of Decision, and that song is on his album. And that is so today. I mean, that's the thing about Phil. It's a freaky thing. He's been gone 47 years.
That's
And
great.
so many of his songs are still relevant.
Yes, I make that point in the podcast as well. I mean, it's remarkable. It's like,
And that one, more than anything else, actually, if you think about these are the days of decision. I mean, my gosh, how up to date could you be? And let's see. I didn't mention In the Heat of the Summer, which again is still relevant with all the racial crap that's going on. And I did mention Houston, the state of Mississippi. He did that one over. One I love, where was it that I read? Oh, on Days of Decision, he says, this is on the album. You don't have the actual album, do you?
I don't. I was going to actually ask you to show the listeners the back jacket if you could.
With back jacket.
Yeah,
You
cool.
know.
Yeah, I've only had it on CD and of course now through streaming
Okay.
services.
Well, this you'll find enlightening. On Days of Decision, tell me what that this wasn't written yesterday, okay?
Sure.
This is Phil's take on it. The American politician has developed into a gutless master of procrastination with a maximum of non-committal statements and the barest minimum of action. This moral vacuum is exceeded only by the apathetic public who allows him to stay in power. How feeble is the effect of a song against such a morass? But here it is. But I mean,
Yeah,
that could have been written today, right?
yeah. It's like he's a political commentator today. It's
right. And then other things that are interesting, not from this album, but with relevancy. Take the song There But for Fortune and the line, show me the ruins of the buildings once so tall. One of my, I do Phil Ochs song nights, and one of my musicians took that song, changed one word, show me the ruins of the towers once so tall. And it's like,
wow.
wow, you know. And then what was the other one? Oh, I Ain't Marching Anymore. It's always the old who lead us to the war, always the young to fall. And one of my musicians added the second time around, it's always the rich who lead us to the war, always the poor to fall. I mean, so
Yeah.
47 years later, and it's still, he was amazing. He was an amazing writer. He really was.
Yeah, and he just picked up in addition to the right. I mean, everyone talks about his lyrics because obviously they're so
Right.
brilliant and impactful, but like he was a really gifted musician too. I mean, his
I thought so,
melodies, I
yeah.
think are very strong, and I think he was a pretty fine guitar player as well. And you know, it's easy to forget about that just because the words are so powerful. You know?
Mhm. And a lot of people put him down for various things. I laugh at him. His second songbook, which I think is called The War Is Over, has a black cover. And inside there's one page called The Critics Raved. And it's a whole page of like one-liners of negative reviews that he got. And it is very, very funny when read in that context. Yeah.
Seems like he had a bit of a sense of humor about.
Oh, he did. Yeah, you have to have a sense of humor. Yeah. But anyway,
So obviously around this time he was amongst all the folk legends, if you will. What was his relationship like with Dylan?
that was very negative. Anybody will tell you that. Dylan was, I personally do not like the man. Okay. That
Fair. Uh-huh.
I will say that he has written some really powerful, great songs, a handful of really classics, but he's very self-involved. And he seemed to get his rocks off by hurting Phil. I mean, he would put him down. And you can ask anybody. A lot of people heard this. They saw it time and again. I think back in the beginning, he may have been insecure, but he had to be the star. And what's better way? Was the same thing that our dear ex-president does. Criticizing, making fun of other people and bullying them. And this was, you've probably heard the famous car incident where they were riding in a car together, and as they all did in the day, Dylan had written a new song, and he said to Phil, "Here, listen to this, see what you think."
Mm-hmm.
And Phil listened, and Phil was very honest, very, very honest.
Right.
He said, Bob, I don't really think that's as good as some of the other stuff you've written.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Dylan got so angry that he had whoever was driving stop the car, and he said to Phil, "Get out. You're nothing but a second-rate journalist. What do you know?"
Crazy.
I mean, so I'm sorry, but I just have no love for the man. No.
No need to apologize. Oh, yeah, it's interesting. I wasn't aware of that relationship
But he had close relationship with Paxton. They were really good friends.
Yeah,
And,
that I
and
know.
Eric Anderson, they
Mhm.
were very close. And yeah, there were a bunch of them. They hung out together. Van Ronk was a very, very dear friend of his.
Right.
And there was a place on McDougal Street called the Kettle of Fish. It was down the end of the block. It was, I think, like a bar.
Okay.
And that's where they would mainly hang out. And they
Mhm.
visited each other there a lot.
Right. Okay. And then it's at some point, he decided to kind of move away from political music, sort of get into the music of Elvis, change his persona a little bit.
Yeah.
Can you discuss that period and how it was received?
Well, I personally didn't go for it. He moved to California and to the LA area, I think Topanga Canyon maybe. But all I know is LA has a whole different vibe that I personally dislike immensely. LA has no, how can I put it? Everybody in LA is from somewhere else.
Right.
There's no history there. There's no base. There's,
Hmm.
and everybody's trying to outdo each other. And like my brother Michael took me to a club in LA. I went out there way back, and in the club they had the downstairs area, which was for the peons and other paying customers, and upstairs was where the important people sat. And that each record company, in those days, the record companies were the rulers, and they each had their own long table. And that's, if you were important, you sat at one of the tables upstairs. So Michael took me upstairs because, of course, he knew the important people. And we go upstairs, and he would introduce me to people. And within a minute or two, when the person found out that I couldn't do anything for them because I wasn't important,
Right.
disappear. Yeah. So that to me is the persona of Hollywood. It's like trying to get ahead and trying to be the top. And, I just don't like that kind of a feeling. And it wasn't, New York was not that way at all. They were all buddies. They hung out together. And
Yeah. And he, so do you think he just got intoxicated by trying to be a
well,
star?
other people were, well, I guess Dylan was one of the leaders in this, going electric and, trying to change your way. I mean, Pleasures of the Harbor, I believe, is probably Phil's top selling album.
Right.
And it has some beautiful, beautiful songs on it. And the orchestration is fascinating. His piano player, Lincoln Mayorga, is unbelievable. He did Small Circle of Friends. He does that Honky Tonk Piano. You're really, really good. And the song itself, Pleasures of the Harbor, it's like a concert piece. I love that song and the way it was recorded. But to me, the highlight of Phil is the early stuff that he did, the early songs that he wrote. My favorite album is the In Concert album.
I agree. Yeah.
And I mean, you think about it, go back to the day. I remember when he did that was his first Carnegie Hall concert, January, I think 6th, was January 1966, that I know for sure.
Mhm.
And I went with my mother and my grandmother, and I don't remember who else was with us. They gave us seats 4th row center. Those are the best seats, by the way. Front row is not the best because you're craning your neck and it's not comfortable. 4th row center is where they put the critics so that they'll get a good review.
Mhm.
So we were in 4th row center. And I'll never forget, I'm looking around and I'm thinking, my God, my brother's going to be up on the stage all by himself. And all of these people have sold out, of course. All of these people are here to see him. And I was just so proud, so proud. And I turned to my grandmother. I said, Grandma, what do you think? And I'm waiting for her to say how wonderful her grandson is. Her reply, she looks around the auditorium and she says, a barber could make a good penny here. So she kind of put things back into
Right.
but the thing that is so amazing, that particular concert I remember so well. Here is one man up on the stage with one instrument and one microphone.
Right.
Think about it. I mean, today, when I do these shows, I freak out because the performers I get to do the shows, I mean, the wires, you practically kill yourself tripping over all the wires to get to the microphone. It's crazy.
Right. And yeah, it's just stripped down, but it's all he
It,
needed.
it was the words that were important.
Yeah. Right. And at the time too.
Right. And then if you go into folk rock, to me, whenever, well, I do radio. I've been doing radio off and on for over 30 years.
Hmm.
And I constantly get CDs in the mail.
Sure.
And whenever I'll put a CD on, the minute I hear a bump, bump kind of drum, out. I don't hear it.
It's not on that back shelf there, huh?
Why do you write the lyrics if you can't hear the damn words? I mean, they drown themselves out. It's nuts.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's amazing. Yeah. So then he, I guess it was in the early 70s, perhaps. Then he started to take on causes outside of America. It was in Chile and Argentina, I believe.
Well, I don't know about Argentina, but Chile,
Okay.
that was very crucial. He went to Chile and he met Victor Jara,
Right.
who was basically, he was Phil Ochs plus of Chile. He was a known and loved folk singer, but he was also an actor and he was an activist, and he wonderful songwriter. And Phil went down to Chile and I think they accidentally met on the street. Victor saw Phil and introduced himself, took Phil to sing for the miners down there. And, so they actually had interaction. And then when the coup came along and they murdered Allende, they arrested Victor Jara and they tortured him in the stadium and then killed him. And that really affected Phil. He was really, really upset by that.
Yeah.
And he actually put together a concert. This is okay. I'll have to say one good thing about Dylan.
Right. That's I was going to ask. Yeah.
So he put together a concert with friends of his who helped organize it. And Phil, by the way, was also manic depressive, which is bipolar, as they call it today. And he was in one of his manic stages, and he put this amazing collection of people together. But they called it An Evening with Salvador Allende.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to go to see a show. Evening with Salvador, who the hell is Salvador Allende? Americans are so ignorant, they don't know, they don't really keep up with any news outside of the country. So a lot of people wouldn't even know who Salvador Allende was or what happened to him. And tickets were just, he had good people. He had Van Ronk and he had Melvin Van Peebles. I forget who else, Arlo, I think, was there. But the tickets were not selling and they were going to lose money big time. Now, I don't know who, I think it was probably Phil, called up Dylan and basically begged him to come and be part of the show. And Dylan agreed. He decided he would do it. So he came and the place, it sold out.
Right.
So he did Phil that favor. But the concert was a benefit for Chilean refugees because a lot of people, socialists were fleeing the country because the junta had taken over and they were going after people.
Right.
And so this was a benefit for them. And so that was one of his foreign adventures. He went to Africa. I don't know if he went once or twice. I know that he did a concert in Johannesburg, which was awful because he was drunk and he really, I have a review somewhere that was in the paper about how bad his performance was. But also while he was there, he went for a walk on the beach. I forget which country he was in, and he got mugged.
Yeah.
And strangled. And that really destroyed his vocal cords. He lost about the top 3 or 4 notes of his singing range. And that really upset him. That really knocked him for a loop.
Right.
And,
Yeah. And then he returned, right? And I think, was it around this time where he took on that new identity of the John Butler Train identity?
that was so nuts. That was part of his manic craziness. Yeah, he called himself John Train. I have no idea what that was about. He was crazy. And he was just acting out and very violent, actually. And at some point, he was actually sleeping in doorways. He I think he knocked on Van Ronk's door and Van Ronk wouldn't let him in, which I don't blame him. He was right. Phil was crazy.
Mm.
And then he crashed. And then he called me up and he asked if he could come stay at my house for a couple of days. And I said, of course. By then he was quiet. Had he been the way he had been, I wouldn't have let him in. Because I had children,
Yeah.
And so he came out to stay with me, and it ended up being about at least 3 months. But he was in the depressive state, so he was really quiet, and then he killed himself.
Yeah, and he wouldn't accept help, right? Like people, it seemed like people were trying.
Kept asking him to go for help, and he wouldn't go. One of the things back then, if you had manic depression, there was only one drug that they gave out, and that was called lithium.
Right. Yeah.
And lithium is what they call a flatliner.
Mm-hmm.
You have no highs, you have no lows. You just And for a creative person, that's horrible.
Right.
You can't do anything. But anyhow, so the last week of his life, and I finally got him to go to a psychiatrist to get the medication.
Sure.
And he went once, and he got a prescription that he had a bottle of lithium tablets, whatever. And every night I'd say to him, Phil, did you take your medicine? And he'd say yes. And after he died, I found the bottle. He had never even taken one.
Right. Yeah. So I think I know the answer to this question, but I'd like to get your take on it. What do you think he would think about today's political climate?
Oh my God, he'd be writing 24
Yeah.
hours a day. There is more material out there today than you can.
Right. He'd be pretty active, I think.
Oh, I think so, definitely. My God, there's just so much.
Yeah, but there seems to be no voice now.
Oh, no. You see, that's where you're making a mistake. And that's not your fault. It's because of the freaking division of sources.
Okay. Let me rephrase, perhaps. There seems to be no central figure that people connect with in a mass.
There's no one person. Well, there was, but he died, Pete Seeger.
Oh, sure, yeah.
But there are a lot of them out there who are writing the same kind of music as Phil wrote.
Right.
People who are wonderful people. Okay, first of all, if you're not aware of it, are you aware of the internet station called Folk Music Notebook?
I am not.
Yay, another convert I'm going to get. Folk Music Notebook was started by Ron Olesko, who lives in New Jersey, who runs, I forget which one of the well-known coffee house, and he also has a radio show on a Jersey college station, FDU maybe, I'm not sure.
Oh, Fairleigh Dickinson, perhaps. Okay.
Could be Fairleigh Dickinson, but he's on one of those stations.
Sure.
Just if you Google Ron Olesko, you'll get him. Recently, I think, how many years, at least 2-3 years ago, maybe 4 years now, he started an internet station, which he calls Folk Music Notebook. And you can access it by going to Google and type in folkmusicnotebook.com.
Mm-hmm.
And Folk Music Notebook is 24/7 folk music. Every day, every night, all day, all night, folk music. He plays, well, he's the one who got me to go back on the radio at my show. I have a show on there on the 4th Sunday of every month.
On that station?
Yes.
Okay.
He has Marilyn Ray Beyer, who used to be on UMB in Massachusetts. She just took over Rich Warren's show, Midnight Special in Chicago.
Sure.
Her show is on there. Matt Watroba from Detroit, his show is on there. Rick Pagliari from Vermont, he does the show. I mean, he plays all of these. He does live at Cafe Lena. I mean, he does all kinds of interesting shows. Plus, there's just general folk music going all morning long, the whole morning. There's different songs playing from every kind of genre of folk. And so if you don't like one song, you might like the next one. It's just such an interesting mix. A guy named Joe Jenks has a talk show where he interviews people. It's called My Highway Home. And Joe's very good. Joe was one of a group called Brother Son, who were also very political. And it's just John Flynn. I don't know if you know John Flynn.
I'm not familiar with John.
Oh, you see, this is what gets me.
But this is great. I'm glad that you're mentioning this. Yeah.
Okay, John Flynn Okay, we do something called, we give out a Phil Ochs Award every year. There's a guy who lives up near me, he and his wife, who worship Phil. And each year we get together, we choose a performer who not just talks the talk, but also walks the walk, who goes out and demonstrates or does something really important.
Right.
Among the winners, we have had John Flynn. John Flynn works with prisoners in a prison down, he lives in Delaware.
Okay.
And he started a group within the prison, just prison guys talking.
Mhm.
And he calls the group New Beginnings. And it's become so popular, it's spreading now to other prisons. And the recidivism rate of this prison is like 70-something%.
Mhm.
The recidivism rate of John's group is like 20-something%.
Oh, wow.
He's making a difference.
Yeah.
After he did this, he's done this for years now. After they get out of prison, all of us are here, they're free now. And what? He got a phone call from a guy who had gotten out and said, John, please help, please come and have coffee with me. I'm desperate. I don't know what to do. So John met with this guy. Long story short, there's now a group called New Beginnings Next Step, and they meet outside of prison. These are ex-prisoners.
Okay.
And they've set up a program where they get them work. They work, some of them work in the thrift shop. They get them free bus passes to get to work. I mean, it's just, so somebody like that. And
Right.
the songs he writes incredible songs. Check him out, John Flynn.
Absolutely.
He has a lot of albums, and a lot of his songs are very political. Most of, but so he was one of the winners. Charlie King, who started the People's Music Network, which I don't know if you've heard of that, but that's a collection of political musicians who meet twice a year,
Mhm.
once in the summer at a camp somewhere, and each winter at a different city.
Okay.
They exchange music and they have panels and what have you. Charlie King was the founder of that. So he was one of our winners. Then we had somebody named John McCutcheon,
I know that name. Mhm.
Okay, John McCutcheon was one of the founders of the Local 1000, which is a union of traveling songwriters.
Mhm.
And so he's done so much that way, and he's very active in labor movement.
Right.
Pat Humphreys, who was, you probably don't know her name either. No, well, check her out.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean,
These are people who who walked. Pat Humphreys has gone every year. They had the demonstrations down at the something of the Americas, where School of the Americas, which is a place where they train basically Central and South American people to suppress, suppress the population. But these are the kinds of people that I've been dealing with, and who are writing the songs, and they're still writing the songs.
yeah, that's great. I mean, I'm aware that there are people out there who are making a difference and are impactful. And I'm really thankful that you mentioned all the names you mentioned and the stations and such. I guess more to the point, it's just everyone knew, not everyone knew, but Phil was a very popular figure, Joan Baez, Dylan, of course. And
That was because they were the top 40 in their day.
right. Yeah, it was
Because
it was
of the
popular music.
Vietnam War. Yeah.
Yeah. And I wonder if that'll ever be again. If political music can
If
get
people get disgusted enough,
right.
maybe it will, I don't know. But in the meantime, there's always been this undercurrent. It's been there all along. It hasn't gone away. It won't go away. But it's an undercurrent and not the main thing. And my thing is to get people like Tori Nelson, who I said is doing the podcast on Phil,
Right.
to get people like Tori to get out there. And we just did a Phil Ochs song night in Brookline, Massachusetts, which is a suburb of Boston.
Sure. Yeah, I lived over there.
And did the show. Two young women, independent of each other, came up to me and said, I love your brother's music. Now, these are like college age
Right.
kids. And both of them said that they had learned about it from Tori.
Mm.
They somehow found her podcast. So and she puts stuff out on TikTok. I've got how many hundreds of thousands of people have seen her TikTok stuff, and most of it's about Phil.
It's great. It's
I mean,
great.
she's really spreading the word.
Right. Yeah. And, that's kind of part of the purpose of this podcast as well. I mean, when I give people the list of albums, I'm shocked that there's a lot of people who don't know the name Phil Ochs. And I'm hopeful and desirous that, even if we can convert a couple people to his music and also his ideas, I think it's very valuable. Um, I want to ask you just one final question. What would you like people to remember about Phil Ochs? How would you like him to be remembered?
As a very brilliant, honest, forthright, well-spoken voice for the left-wing movement. I mean, he was one of the founders of the Yippies.
Yeah. And then it seems like there was a point where he kind of moved away from them, right? With the Yippies and Abby Hoffman and such.
Yeah. Well, Abby was a piece of work. Jerry Rubin, on the other hand, people don't know this about Jerry. Jerry was so true to Phil right to the end. When Phil was living with me, Jerry was the one who stepped forward and really tried to help.
Yeah, I think I saw that. There's the one documentary I was watching, and I saw him being interviewed quite a bit. Fantastic. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Did I miss anything? Anything you'd like to tell the listeners?
No, just listen to folk music because you can learn so much from that, and check out the new performers. There are so many of them, really are.
Great. I want to thank you. Thanks so much for joining me. It was a real pleasure.
Oh, my pleasure.
Okay, take care now.
Okay, you too. Nice meeting you.
Nice to meet you.